That's right, yeah. Okay, all right, good. So, let's turn this on so I can talk. I want to, I'm the last speaker, so I have 2 minutes to talk. And one of the things I want to say is that both Alan and I have been, not involved in the small talk world for a number of years, right? I mean, my last small talk client was in 2000. Oh, I'm so sad. But anyway, and so I've had to live in the Java world, all right, for many years, okay. And I just had to get over it because I wanted to still earn money, and it was very hard for me to do so. But this talk is talking about the influences, where object design has moved and where it is today, and some directions where it's headed. And it all comes back to Tektronix. I want to make a comment that for those of you who don't know about it, that there's a lot of design branches that started with some creative people at Tektronix. Extreme programming came from a lot of the ideas of how we were just rapidly developing and testing as we went. We just did that. Kent was on a boat in Norway when he and Ron Jeffries, and Alan and I were there, coined, we want to brand this and make it sound really interesting, and we want people to really get this. So what can we call it? What can we do to make this? And they said, calling it extreme will get people interested. And it made Jim Copleen, who was listening to at the time, and he was also there, got very angry with, extreme, no, it should just be the way you do it. Anyway, it was really very interesting. Design patterns came from some wacky ideas that Ward had reading a book, this timeless way of building with Alexander, and trying out actually to describe the very first patterns that they tried to describe in this little reading group were based on some of the window patterns that you did in Smalltalk applications. They were actually really bad patterns, but that was their first attempt. And then it came from other places. And then responsibility-driven design, which I was responsible for. And so what is, responsibility-driven design? One might think that it means, what does RDD mean? Does it mean recommended daily dosage? That's how much vitamins you should take. Or does it mean, it's the call letters of the Reading Municipal Airport, radar detectors, reactive design, it means a lot of things, but what we meant was responsibility-driven design, okay? And it started out as an initial, I wanted to write a paper that got accepted at UPSLA, and so I said to my colleague Brian Wilkerson, let's write a paper. And we wanted to compare and contrast the design differences if you took a data-centric view first for something that seemed very data-centric, like a graphic image. And we showed if you did it in a data-centric way, that you would come up with a whole different design for it than you would behavioral or responsibility, what should it do point of view. But my inspiration, at least, was the image, right? Whenever you send a message to a class that doesn't implement it, my subclass should have overridden one of my messages. You get that error, and you go, there's a subclass responsibility to implement. Now, I don't think that the people at Xerox PARC that had the image could claim that they implemented, came up with the idea of responsibility-driven design, but to me, this resonated with any time that I am building a class, I have to think about its responsibilities, not just subclasses. So that kind of led to that style of thinking. So this is, our first paper that we wrote in 1989, and we did a design of, very data-driven design, and we compared it first with responsibility, and thinking about what data types and what algorithms can be applied to the data were the focus of the order of thinking if you had a data-driven approach. And so then in 4 months of intense writing, we knocked out this book next year. And my brother designed the cover. I want to give acknowledgement to him. And there was no UML, there was no diagrammatic way of thinking about it, but we thought about how do classes interact, objects and subsystems, and showed people how to do a couple of designs as well as what our thinking process was. At that same time, at UPSLA 89, there were a lot of interesting papers by people who were not just doing language design, although that was very important to enable us to do it, but also how do I think about objects? Because back then, it was new, right? Oh, how do I think about objects? And initially, Ward and Kent, I think Ward somehow invents everything that I then take and run with, seriously. And from their paper, they talked about using CRC cards, and that stands for Class Responsibility Collaborator, as a tool for thinking, for teaching beginners, because they didn't want them to get hung up in the programming language constructs that were difficult, like smalltalk syntax. Now, we think it's simple, but actually you get an assembly language programmer and all those little colons and things. Oh, where's the message and where are the arguments? Get kind of hard because they like to load them in registers and see where they are. Anyway, so they had this and they used MVC as an example in that paper. So just talking about what responsibility-driven design's philosophy was again into that style of thinking, roles of interacting objects that collaborate, that have work that they do, a bunch of informal tools and techniques and concepts and thinking tools so you could have a way of expressing ideas, right? And it's interesting when you think about concepts and thinking tools. I like to think of it as a palette of things that you can take and blend together, right? And so it's not like to do responsibility-driven design, I have to do everything. But if I have a thinking tool that helps augment, I can dip a little in here and apply it, and it helps clarify my thinking about how do I solve a problem. And the principles, and these were written about, first book, were to maximize abstraction, which meant hiding the distinction between data and behavior. Originally, we got slammed for that, right? Because people said, well, how can you do anything without data? And, well, data is just an object, as we just heard Hernan talk about. But the idea was to focus on what something should do first and then decide on how to implement it. And then that you don't want to have one object do everything. You'd like to distribute behavior, make them smart. Doing things with what they know is kind of a clever little trick. And that's something I find today that Java programmers really kind of miss that idea. And then the other thing was that you wanted to make the design flexible so that you can change the insides. You've got to really worry about the implementation not leaking out. And you notice these principles are talking about it, and it was all came from Smalltalk when we had no interfaces in the programming language. So we mentally had to invent them and talked about contracts and well-defined interfaces. What are they done? So it really is the case that if you at that time there were different kinds of ways of coming up with my model of objects. And predominantly there at that time, before responsibility-driven design came and was a data-driven approach, but also people developed a model, based on actor-based, where objects are really state machines and they react to events. and that's just what they are, is little state machines. Or they were a set of rules that could fire, or maybe, I don't know, what the hell ever I came up with, the ad hoc way. But they really do have an influence on the key abstractions, how you distribute the data and behavior and package it, and patterns of collaboration and visibility, and what you consider a good design or not. And so back in the day, I used to use this example, and it was in our object design course, and John's looking at me, nodding in the audience and saying, yeah, beating the old horse again, flogging that horse again. But if I think about designing a horse, not that objects model the real world. They don't. They model what you need to do. If I'm thinking about a horse from a data-driven perspective, and this is like the people that are database designers did, well, I'm thinking about the head and the body, and they're connected, and I have 4 legs and a tail, and I have to understand the relationships between them, and I better have only 4 legs, because that's really what a horse is, and it has to have these relationships between them, and that's really, there's no behavior there. It's just the structural relationships between them. The event one is kind of another 2-dimensional view that is, I like to think of it as a horse on a carousel. You think about start and stop and speed up and slow down and whatever those events that horse has to react to. And then you design a little state model inside of it to implement that. And responsibility-driven design is one where you take a step back and say, well, what's this horse supposed to do? Is it supporting, a rider or somebody maybe who's racing? Might be a little different horse if that were the case. Or maybe the horse is just eating grass and pooping, or whatever. Right? And no matter what it is, you have to understand what it's doing for you in your application, and then step back and think about, well, what's the interface to that? And then what do I need to support it? And so a model of that is typically informal. This is a student from a class long ago who came from learning object design from from COBOL programming, and they're using CRC cards and drawing at this time. Sort of quasi-UML, but there's this database thingy in the middle that they're sending messages to. So it's a pretty informal kind of set of techniques for thinking about it. And then in 2002, wrote another book that kind of captured some of the ideas that had been mulling in our heads for the last 10 years. One of them is that instead of just thinking about objects in isolation, you need to think about patterns and kind of the network of objects that exist in applications that you see, and role stereotypes, which came, so it was 1992, right, had a way of saying, well, which one, what is the way that I think of this object? And if it fits into it, I understand that it's an apple. If it's something like this, well, it's got a different role. I have to understand it. And not to go into great detail, but I came up with 6 stereotypes that were common in small talk applications that we had been building for our clients and with our clients. And, information holders, we still have to have data, but I never called them data object, right? Knowing and providing information, because the point was, if you ask it a question, it could go turn around behind its back and go get it however it wants to. You can hold on to it or not. But if you think about encapsulation, it can be a holder or provider of information. And that you also tend to have objects that maintain relationships, and that's their primary responsibility. You have interfacers, you have service providers that perform work on demand, and you have to deal with control and coordination, and how intelligent you are about it or how picky you are about the details determines on the sort of degree of controllers or monitoring and reacting, while coordinators just delegate. And we see those patterns in small talk applications. And, so why this idea of stereotypes? Because it's a lens about thinking about the objects or components that you need in a design, to look at an existing implementation. And I loved looking at your code, because I was thinking, what are all these objects that... to study a design, and if you're get, again, more clever about it, that I can make objects more responsible and make my design simpler by information holders that can compute, or service providers that alter their behavior over time by maintaining information so they can do things more intelligently. So, I could compare two designs, and this was back in the 1992. This looks like a spider in the web, doesn't it? And so this was a report that was done by some guys at Boeing, and I don't know if it was before or after John taught them. He helped them design this. No, I'm giving you, no. So this is a data-driven approach to it, and a more delegated approach. And this is before they had sequence diagrams, so they were just drawing and numbering all the sequences of stuff. And I looked at that, and they said responsibility-driven design is better. And they showed two designs, one basically using the data and controlling it versus that. And they said, look, fewer messages has to be better. But, through the lens of me thinking about it, it's like one of them had a centralized control with controllers. Again, I'm using that vocabulary. They only use inheritance to inherit data. Ooh. Many, many low-level messages like set, turn on, turn off, Boolean, and information holders that maybe even held on to one fact. Really, whereas these, they had objects that were delegated control, they had inherited behavior. They just said to the VAT, do something, just do your job, and it would know what to do, and a few smart objects that blended stereotypes. And so for me, I could use the terminology, again, the way of thinking, in order to blend, to analyze existing designs. And you can look at it in design patterns, too. A mediator coordinates, and a strategy is just a service provider. So I tend to use this lens today, even on things. Now, and it turns out that blending is an interesting idea, and the whole value pattern, people like immutable objects, are classes that represent meaningful domain quantities like currency or calendars, and that they hold information but also have the ability to compare and translate between, let's say, RGB and CNY or whatever, or currencies. What day today is on the blue market for Argentinian versus US dollars. That would be a good behavior for, it's going down. Which? Oh, okay. All right. Anyway, I don't want to know. Okay. All right. So these are the concepts, again, from that second wave of responsibility-driven design. Another thing was that introduced the idea of trust regions. I don't know do you know what these blue, I don't know why blue, but anyway, it's blue countries are. They're within the EU, And in theory, within the EU, if you're within a region, it should be easier to conduct commerce, right? Simplified, streamlined communications. Right, okay. So a trust region is an area where trusted collaborations occur, and they should be simplified and streamlined. I mean, that's the idea with economic. That was a good reason for the EU. So if you think about collaborate, the definitions of words are really important when you think about designing objects. There's two definitions of collaboration. One is to cooperate treasonably, like you're a treason, you're a traitor to your country, as with an enemy occupation force. So what do you think I'm going to do when I collaborate with someone like that? I'm trying to save my life, but I don't want to give them information. I don't trust them. I have to interact with them, but I'm going to be very guarded. On the other hand, the second definition of collaborate is one where I work together in a joint effort. And when I work with colleagues, I share information more freely. So the idea of having a trust region or identifying that in the design is something that allows you to not overcheck things, If you identify stuff at the borders, and this is an application I worked on that was in Java, Gemstone J, but basically at the borders you could do cleaning and scrubbing of data and responding to reactive events from these systems that weren't working properly so that the inside could be nice and clean and simple. So understanding and identifying trust regions and coding and designing differently is something to do. So that's just a run-through of responsibility-driven design. There are other influential early design approaches, and one might say that the rational unified process came from a melding of all of these. Booch basically added clouds. Clouds went away. Schleyer, Mailer, and the object modeling technique that James Rumbaugh brought to rational essentially were very much entity relationship-based kinds of views of the world. Objectory added a little bit plus use cases, and that became what Rupp was. An influence from the Smalltalk community, by the way, is the object role analysis and modeling by Trygve Ringskog. How many of you know who Trygve is? Not very many. He invented MVC. Okay. Oh, okay. And he was building applications and he visited Xerox PARC before Smalltalk was released to the world and spent time there and invented MVC. All right. People might beat up MVC, but before that he hadn't. We might say it might not be separated the way we'd like today, blah, 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 whatever. But that's, and since then he has done some work. He's sort of quasi-retired now. But he was very much into roles and interacting roles. And he even had Smalltalk systems that synthesized definitions and built classes on the fly. Very pretty advanced stuff to do, shipping stuff in applications. So, okay, so that's history. What's happened now, since the Smalltalk influence. So RDD started this meme of driven design, driven development meme. So if you hate any DD things, you can blame me, right? And all my buddies. So there are many different DD things, and I will talk just very briefly about a few of them just so that you know. But one would characterize, because Eric Evans doesn't think of himself as an Agile guy, and this is domain-driven design. And feature-driven development it's still done in some European places, but these ones are more Agile, or thought of as Agile. So let me go through just one note. Domain-driven design, responsibility-driven design. Why did these guys do driven? I've asked them because I know all of them, right? And they said, well, it seems like it was the trendy thing to do, to be driven about something, right? It's your focus. Now, originally, Kent had test-first development, so it really was TFD. And I talked to Kent about this because in his book there are a couple of ways that he talks about this. And then he said, well, it wasn't really only about development, it was about design. And I don't know how I got into the driven. It started out as test-first design, but it was more than designing, it was implementing. So I have this long email that I had because I was asking Ken about this. And so he ended up talking about test-driven development. So now instead of driven design, it's now about development and all these things, except for domain-driven design is still design. So there's behavior-driven, contract-driven. This is trademarked by Bertrand. Okay. And I know people, it's basically implementing contracts through aspects kind of in your programming languages that don't have contracts. And Scott Ambler has added some stuff, and there's feature-driven development. And I only bring these two ones because they have model in them. If you ever hear these, it's basically because they are believing in doing formal models that then generate some other model or representation that maybe you get down and it generates the code for you. All right. I'm not going to talk any more about those. Okay. Another important influence in the world, and I have mixed feelings about this. Bob is a very nice guy. I've worked with him. But a lot of people you've heard of solid principles? People hear the name and they go, yeah, I've heard of solid. I don't know what they are. I don't know how to apply them. And the reason is they're principles, they're not practices, so it's very hard. So solid got invented, the name by Mike Feathers, because he says we have to come up with a good name for these things because that will be catchy. I won't say any more about that. But there's a difference between these development practices that's important to think about. They have different design rhythms. They focus on different things and what they consider, what they produce, and what's good. And how teams or people working together develop it. And so feature-driven development is something that is it's like a mini waterfall within the Agile world. So there are still some people who do this, and they actually are quite successful at it, but it's not really talked about in the Agile conferences I go about. But they have a domain walkthrough. They do some design, they inspect, they code inspect. And if I could characterize this design rhythm, if you had a 2-week sprint, if you're doing Scrum, they design in the first week and code in the second. Okay. All right. And on the other hand, test-driven development, which is just one slice out of 12 XP, extreme programming practices, says story by story, write the simplest test of whatever you're testing, unit, run the test, make it fail first, write the simplest code that will make it pass, repeat until the story is tested and implemented. And one might say, where does design happen in this? I mean, it's a good question to ask. Where does design happen? And I say it happens between the keystrokes, because you usually should be pairing with someone, having conversations. Oh, yeah. And then you're thinking and talking and then coding. So it's a very fast cycle that way. Now, when I characterized this, when I gave this talk another time, they thought I was being insulting. Oh, you mean only between the keystrokes? No, that's a good thing. I mean, it's not, I'm thinking fast on my feet. So there's this red-green refactor kind of thing. But there's not any artifact that represents your design other than the code and your tests. So test-first development, which some people practice in TDD, says write a test first, check if it fails, write some code, run my tests, they all pass. Oh, yeah, maybe I should clean up and refactor, go back, do some more testing, write some more functionality, and that sort of cycle goes around and around. Now, what I've observed in myself and in other people is that they don't always write tests first. They may write some code, and then they write tests. So I've also seen that a discipline that works, although some purists would call this controversial, I call this test-frequent development, and that's actually the style I like to do, actually, is basically write some code, because I've been sketching or thinking, and then I write some code. I'm going to have to have it. If I had an existing test, fine. If I don't, I'm going to have to write some, because I want to test it or exercise it. This is what we used to do back in Smalltalk. Have a browser open, have an inspector, have stuff, write some tests in my workspace, right? And then if it fails, I need to clean up and refactor. But it's not always the case that I write one first and the other. It's like whatever I need to know, then I do. But I'm still thinking about tests that write and must pass before I'm done. So Scott Ambler, who did this Agile model-driven development, he adds a little bit of modeling or envisioning or thinking before doing. So it's not just at the keystroke level. And that if I'm starting a sprint or an iteration, as he calls it, I might have some modeling for a few hours before I go, particularly if it's new, or I might be noodling on a whiteboard. Not just coding fast. If I need to think something through, if I'm taking a story, then I might take if I have to think about it a little bit, let's have some discussion. He calls it model storming. And then I can do this intense coding cycle. So he's really inserting into here a little more, I can think without writing code into the process. Behavior-driven development, which was Dan North and a bunch of his colleagues, and now it's pretty much executable specifications at a higher level, essentially has this, given some initial context of the system, when something happens and here are the values, then I want to test something. One might think, how is this different than a unit test? Well, usually it's written in the terms that a business person could express, and it can be automated. And these things aren't really tests, but they're, I'm going to say, scenario-based sketches of what I expect from behavior. And this is actually pretty popular these days in the Agile community, and there are tools that allow people to automate these things and have analysts and those type of people write them and then get executed. So here's a low-level version of that looks very much saying, and Dan doesn't say it's not really new stuff. Some of the people out there trying to sell it said he would try to put more into it. It's a rephrasing to him of existing good practice, not a radical departure. But it's at a higher level that hopefully somebody could do that's a business analyst type person. So this is a very low-level example of just using this given, when, then for what you expect to happen when you close a window. So Eric Evans added this thing about focusing on the domain model. Now, in Smalltalk, we had model view controller, right? So we have always had model in there. But Eric, who was a Smalltalker doing financial software, and also a student of Ralph Johnson, so there's a small world, basically tried to, I believe, add to, try to put more behavioral focus on the entity relationship world that we need to think about. So he talks about, and we do have to think about it if we're not using Gemstone. Even if we're using Gemstone, we still have to think about persisting and retrieving things. And we have to think about object roots. We really do have to think about that stuff, even if we don't translate it to a relational database. Eric added the vocabulary of an entity object is distinguished by its identity. It could have a life cycle and even change its structure. But it has identity, whereas value objects needn't be unique. And he has a whole set of practices about isolating domain objects and how do I manipulate them, verify them, and move them through their life cycle. The other thing that he is quite interested in these days is that to recognize that there isn't just a model, but we have in complex applications multiple domains. And they may interact, and instead of just having them be muddy, we talk about translations and anti-corruption layers. He has ways of talking about design so that I can preserve and have a clean domain core. So that's my run through of the driven stuff. And in my head, I've always been able to unify them completely. I don't know why is that. They all seem to add a set of good practices, but they value that your designs are expressive. I mean, I think domain modeling is a good thing. Eric has given us some ways of talking about it. That it's understood, that it's coherent, that it's maintainable. And if I have tests and I separate and isolate, and it's predictable and it's changeable. So, and one thing to think about is that all of these practices, even though they're driven development, are really about designing and implementing places where our software we create is a place that we as developers and designers feel comfortable in extending and growing, and living with them for a period of time. Now, everyone has their different flavor of what they want to emphasize first, or whether they like sketching or thinking, or whether they just love to go at the keyboard or not. But they really do care about habitable software that I can change. I mean, those common values are there. And I think that sustainable design is one where we take care with it, that we follow through, that we do ongoing attention to the little details that can undermine our ability to change and shape and grow and extend our software. And these are kind of the values that are going forward. So that's what I wanted to say. If you have questions, comments. So this is not an advertisement. This is an Alan's sweatshirt, but I loved it so much that I wear it. It was at the beach. This is in Cannon Beach, Oregon, where we live. And it's not always a clear, sunny day at the beach. In fact, it's raining and like 8 degrees right now in Oregon. So it's very cold and miserable. But I like to think of this beach and that we need to build a place where we're comfortable. And that's really kind of the design practices that are going on today. So. Yeah.
So, you see a review of all these approaches to building software.
Yeah.
But I didn't get if you say that any one of them, I thought that some of them you say are not too valuable, but I didn't get you say that you pick one or just caring about the result is enough. And the results will come if you are careful and smart.
Okay, so I don't think good design just happens. And I don't think sustainable software just happens. And I don't think that blindly following a particular practice without thinking and reflecting results in good things either. I've seen people abuse any design approach or technique, from TDD to responsibility-driven design. So it isn't just the set of practices that results, but really reflecting on your ability to change and adapt and creating stuff that has the flexibility and the clarity of the design. So a lot of these separation of concerns, finding the right abstractions, finding interfaces, finding ways of extending a design without hacking over it, all result in good, sustainable software. But so any practice can be abused. I think that what we need to keep in mind is there are ways of thinking that have different emphasis. Depending upon what you value, you may add or subtract. But I start from first principles, responsibility-driven design, and always add practices. That's how I think, my mind. And it's only because responsibility-driven design gives you a vocabulary, I believe, for looking at things. You know, like rule stereotypes or from an object-oriented programming way, give you a vocabulary to dissect patterns and see whether you like them. Control styles give you a way of analyzing what you're ending up with. But it just gives you a vocabulary. Now, what you do as a designer depends upon what you value. So if you're building on a data-rich domain model, then domain modeling constructs can really help you a lot. And it's interesting that most of these people who've written books, and they've all written books, all know and kind of do each other's practices. So Eric would say, yeah, responsibility-driven design is how I think, but here's entities. So they add, but they focus on certain things. Test-driven development is not enough, in my opinion. It's just a technique. It doesn't tell you what a good model is. And that's lacking. And I think solid principles are also lacking because they don't give you actions to do. So. Yeah.
So, seems to me that your design or sense that still good, then older they might, or their employees might get from the culture of people actually writing software. Same way that houses always start together. So it might be hard perhaps to find an answer to each employee's go through the technical. Nevertheless, you mentioned now that people sometimes can feel abuse. Have you found such that in the interest of improving our own design, have you found defining characteristics of what constitutes abuse in that respect?
Yeah. If give you a good example, we talked about just let's use test-driven development. If one test is good, I must write 100, right? Does that make my design better? Not necessarily. But adding more tests might make it more brittle to a change because I may be testing too much. And, that's a good example. I've seen people have, they say, we can't change the design because it will break our tests. Whoa, okay. There's something wrong with that. Okay, and someone might say, why don't you just throw away your tests? Because are they testing at the right level? So I also teach a TDD class, and I get people to say, maybe you should throw away your tests, or what is the right level to test? So that's just one example of abuse. I also have taught classes where we learn design patterns. And people, if they learn the new hammer, everything is a nail and they want to hit it, right? Wham, wham, wham. So they over-abuse and maybe create too many patterns, abstractions where they really don't need them. So it's almost like when they get a new thinking tool or a technique, the abuse I see is overusing it rather than learning judgment about where to use it. I think sustainable development or habitable software is what I strive for. And that means that most software that's successful does change and get new features and all these things. And I just have to be comfortable as a developer or a development team in that ecosystem that I've created. And so I may discover, for example, that I have to pick perhaps technologies based on a certain point in time. If I'm in the Java or JavaScript world, I pick a framework or a library. But I want to make sure that ecosystem continues to support what I need to do. So maybe I need to swap out a new framework. Maybe I need to refactor. Maybe I need to But I think really software that I can feel comfortable with making changes and fixes to over time is, and it's not a painful process to do is what I'm looking for. So habitable software is software that we developers like to live in. I mean, have you gone to places in code that you have not written, because obviously you probably write beautiful code, where it just is painful to make any sort of change because it's very brittle. Yeah. All right, I hate that code. I don't want to live there, right? I think that the parts of systems that need to change need to be habitable. Okay, so not all parts should be beautiful and but the parts that are going to change need to be habitable. And that's what we should strive for. Okay.
So I think, do you think that RDD address the problem of level of action? Do you know that you have classes that are abstract and others are concrete, but in the design or architecture of your application, sometimes you have things that refer to some low-level support or something, and then you have another section where you are talking about your domain object.
Yes.
So, for instance, I think you were referring to something that may be wrong, but if I talk into an object in the language of that object, like force, drag, or speed, or whatever, or speed, and then I send force yourself doesn't fit.
Right.
So the question is, do you think your RT addresses those situations?
Well, I think that if I understand what are going to be the clients of an object's public interface, that will help me a lot think about it. So I was always thinking about the terms of use, and sometimes we have to have, based on certain frameworks, again I'm thinking of Java, where I've spent a lot of years, there's a lot of extra baggage that you may have, but your core of what you're doing should all fit and be at the same level for this and this object that you're designing. And you may have some utility methods that you have to implement that are part of its behavior because I need to serialize this thing or whatever. But that's not really the core of the thing that I designed. It's what I have to implement in order to fit into an environment. So yeah, I think that understanding the usage of an object and making sure that you have an idea of how much sophistication you require that user of the object to know. Now, sometimes you may want to give very fine control to an external client, right? And I was looking at some of the modeling, the robots commands or the building blocks. It's like I'm telling all the arguments, big long string to this set of arguments to these builders and blocks and robots. And I was thinking to myself, do I need all those parameters? Or should I be telling it to move or build me a square, right? So this one, there was a pretty one-to-one mapping between what the device or what the Minecraft API gave you, whereas I'm always looking at, is that the right level to reveal to the client? Okay. And again, I think probably with simulations, you probably have the same. It's far easier to say, give me this kind of regression rather than have them give 20 parameters, right? I mean, people screw up. Now, if I give a lot of control to a client, then they can tweak a lot of things. But I like to keep it simple if I can. Yeah.
Well, I noticed that the one direction diagram I saw was the version line.
Yeah.
One feature your design first. The single most useful design tool I got was the bubble and arrow where you see numbers on the message send.
Yeah.
Because you get a sense of, is this a controlling design, is it delegated? You have a sense of, a geometric sense of behavior lives somewhere in space. And when I'm teaching object design now, I talk about object distinctions, and all those bubbles are distinctions. That inside and outside, you get a real sense of communication. I'm wondering...
UML kind of made it become flatland, yeah. And nobody reads UML anymore. I don't know if you're professors out there, but I teach students UML, and they go, oh, that's nice. I guess but they don't use it in their models, so... So, yeah, I think that sense of messaging over time and the level of the power of the message is important. High-level collaborations are ones where you don't have to know a lot about the behavior of that object to ask it to do something. So I can say the horse, take me here. That would be great, right? I love that. Maybe I'll say start and go pretty fast or slow down, speed up. That might be probably more how I really interact with a horse in the real world. But I don't want to have this very low-level interface of go one tick faster, go one tick faster, go a little faster. That to me is, it has the burden on me using this. I think of objects as, if I can streamline communications, because excess communications is just as bad as what Hernan was talking about with, code that was, repeated, because it was, I think excess communications are things between objects that we need to worry about too. So, yeah. Yeah.
So when you're,
so that's a really good point, because if you're creating extra how do I know when this thinking tool isn't working for me? If I believe in domain-driven design and I just really want to try this, and there's entities and value objects and there's services, I didn't talk about all these different things, and I have like 10 different patterns, and my domain model and the validations are nothing because I don't have any to do. I've overdone it. So I've created all these classes that represent a domain model when I really should have just done a SQL write. Okay. And so it's the excess probably in the code is one indicator that it's not working. I created all these classes and they're doing too many tiny little things. Okay. So that's one indicator, right? I'm using something that says here's a set of practices. If my focus is on data and all I'm thinking about is responsibilities, I know I'm missing something, all right? But I can still think about information holders and structures, but maybe I need to think more deeply about the data. So when I go, this isn't buying me any new information applying this concept. In fact, I may be creating extra stuff that doesn't seem to be doing enough, or I may be not getting any insight into my design. Then I move on. So those are two ways to know that something isn't working. Just like tests. Tests are the same way. I write another test, a boundary. Oh, another boundary. Oh, yeah, I know that I had this type. Why am I doing this? Right? So when it's not buying me any information.
Be careful.
Be careful. Okay.
No, you hold this.
No, please go ahead.
Oh. Okay.
So to end it on a somewhat funny note, there was this actual paper, I think, in History of D, that starts with the following phrase, the following actual first phrase of the paper. Suppose, for simplicity, that horses are spheres with diameter d. What do you think of that?
It's a real abstraction, isn't it? And does it work for you? That's the thing about objects, right? Or modeling or design approaches. There was this myth that we used to say that we're modeling the real world, right? And that our representations are out there. But no, they're really concepts we form in our head. Eric Evans is actually lying when he says the ubiquitous language is in the domain, and we just have to go find that common language. What I have found instead is that people need clarity. So sometimes I, as a designer, reveal what the world could be to people there. And they think, oh, you're playing the role of an analyst. Well, no. I really need to make these distinctions in order to make it work. So if a sphere can move and do what I need it to do, great, right? Maybe it's the most compact thing, right? But if it needs to poop and eat hay and grass, it needs a whole subsystem inside, right? Or two or three. Yeah, so, yeah. Okay, so, all right.
So,
Yeah, thank you.